Hello. First of all, I want to acknowledge that today is October 1st, and October is usually when I do Horror Month, which is when I review all the films in different horror franchises. This year, Horror Month is going to be a little late because I wanted to get some videos out of the way before I get on to those reviews, but one of those videos is a review of this book, The Nest by Eli Cantor, published under the pseudonym Gregory A. Douglas. Now, The Nest is a horror novel published in 1980. Now, Eli Cantor had a career that dated back all the way to the 1940s. Aside from being a novelist, he was also a playwright and a poet, and a composer as well. Now, he's written other books under the Gregory A. Douglas pseudonym. Mainly his horror novels seem to have been published under this pen name, whereas his non-genre stuff was published under his actual name. Now, The Nest falls into a subgenre of horror that could be called ecological horror, or nature run amok, or when animals attack stories, which were huge in the 1970s and early 80s, and honestly, today, with climate change being as big of a deal as it is, I'm actually surprised that ecological horror hasn't made more of a comeback in recent years. Now, even if you don't know that Gregory A. Douglas is a pseudonym, you can tell that this book was written by a veteran writer because the book is honestly beautifully written. I've heard several reviewers refer to the prose style as flowery, and that makes it kind of ironic that you have some horrific, stomach-churning scenes in this book written in such elegant prose. Now, the plot of The Nest is it's set on this small island community off the coast of Cape Cod called Yarkie, and due to some freak of evolution that seems to be brought about by a change in the chemicals that they've been using to keep the roach population down in the town dump, we get a new deadly breed of flesh-eating cockroaches. And these roaches, which are way bigger than your normal cockroaches, have these powerful mandibles that can just pick the bones clean and can even grind the bones into dust, leaving nothing left of their victims, and anything that is left, they're just saving for later. And these roaches will devour anything and anyone in their path. So the book follows a group of town officials and residents along with two Harvard scientists who come together to try to take care of Yarkie's roach problem before it's too late. Now, The Nest I thought was a pretty good book. My main issue with it, however, and this would normally not be a criticism at all, but the book is very character-driven. Now again, under normal circumstances, that's actually a good thing. I normally love when stories like this focus more on the character drama because it makes it feel more grounded and makes the horror more believable. The issue here, however, is the characters really aren't that interesting, in my opinion. Again, in my opinion. Other people might find the characters to be more interesting, but to me the characters came off as very cliched, and I hate to say it, a lot of the characters in this book kind of felt like stereotypes out of a 50s B-movie, which you could argue is what Cantor was going for. But again, because the characters, in my opinion, are kind of two-dimensional, and because the book focuses so much on them, it causes the book to kind of drag, in my opinion. Now, the book is a very large ensemble cast of characters, and it's really hard to pinpoint which character you would call the outright protagonist. Technically, the novel has multiple protagonists, but there's sort of a love story at the center of things between this local woman named Elizabeth and one of the scientists, a man named Peter Hubbard, who actually used to live on the island, and I'll be honest, the whole love story between them I found to be really trite. Now, it sounds like I'm really crapping on this book, and I'm not trying to because I actually did like this book a lot. I just want to point out that I did find the characters to be very cliched and two-dimensional. That being said, none of the characters in this book are outright unlikable. You are still meant to root for them. And like I said, the book is extremely well written, and if you're afraid of bugs, then this novel is definitely definitely gonna get under your skin. And Cantor describes the roach attacks in this novel in such vivid and gruesome detail. And the violence in this novel is just unrelenting. There's a scene earlier on in the book where these young punks get high on drugs and strip naked, and the cops try to arrest them, but two of them escape into the woods, but they end up getting caught by the roaches, and let's just say you probably don't want to be naked when you're around flesh-eating cockroaches that can easily go for your junk or go right up your ass. There's also a scene where this couple is attacked by the roaches, and then a friend of theirs stumbles upon their bodies being torn apart, and she sees on the ground what at first she thinks is a giant centipede, but then she realizes that it's one of their intestines being carried away by the cockroaches. There's also an absolutely haunting scene in this book where a whole group of little kids are massacred by the cockroaches, and what makes the scene even more heartbreaking is the fact that you actually got to know some of those kids beforehand. And actually, the father of two of the kids that you see killed in that scene was one of the few characters I actually thought was really three-dimensional, and you feel that character's anguish when he finds out that he's too late to save his kids. And again, even though I found some of the central characters to be kind of flat, you do get to know a lot of the victims of the cockroaches beforehand, and that makes their deaths even more impactful in my opinion. James Herbert did the same thing in his novel The Rats, and it was one of the things I found to be so effective about that novel, and you could tell that The Rats definitely had an influence on this book. It's also one of the things I found to be so effective about Jordan Peele's recent movie Nope. I don't want to give too much away in case you haven't seen Nope, because that is a relatively recent film, but let's just say there's a scene in Nope where a whole group of people die horribly, but what made that scene so disturbing in my opinion is you actually got to know and even empathize with some of those people beforehand. So again, even though I think the central characters were the weakest part of the novel, the side characters who end up falling victims to the bugs, I did think you got to know well enough where you definitely felt sorry for them when they do die. Now, to go back to James Herbert's The Rats for a second, I felt like there were some subtle allusions to that novel in this. For example, before the roaches start attacking people, they primarily feed on the rats in the town dump, and this causes the rats to go crazy, and at first the main characters think that they're dealing with a rat problem. And I almost felt like that was Cantor saying, oh, you thought James Herbert's The Rats was scary? Wait till you see the little fuckers in my novel. The book also seems to have some subtle nods to Peter Benchley's Jaws. For example, you find out that a few years earlier this town dealt with some shark problems, and one of the main characters is the town sheriff, a man named Amos Tarbell, who you find out actually survived a Mako attack once, and even though he's not the main character, you could tell that Sheriff Tarbell is basically supposed to be Brody. But yeah, The Nest. I did have some minor flaws with it. I do think it dragged at some points, and I do think the central characters were not as interesting as I think Eli Cantor wanted them to be. But it's still a book that I would recommend, especially if you like these killer animal type novels or these nature run-amok stories. I would recommend it highly. Now, there was a William W. Johnstone novel called The Uninvited, which came out 2 years after this, which was also about killer cockroaches. I don't know if that novel was inspired by this or not, but I did want to point out that there's also that book. Now, this book was loosely adapted into a 1988 horror film of the same name. Now, the movie takes the skeletal structure of the novel and basically constructs its own story around it. The most that the movie has in common with the book is it's set on an island and it's about killer cockroaches. Some of the character names are similar, but the characteristics are completely different. Now, while in the book these mutant cockroaches sort of just came to be because of some kind of freak of nature, in the movie it turns out that the cockroaches were purposefully made by an evil corporation. And I remember as a little kid seeing the VHS cover of The Nest in Blockbuster. It had that image of the woman being attacked by a giant cockroach, and there's not a scene even remotely like that in the movie. I mean, there are giant cockroaches in the film, but it's not quite what's presented on the poster. It's not a great movie by any means, but it's a fun B-movie, and again, if you're afraid of bugs, then the film is definitely gonna make your skin crawl. And in the movie, they used real cockroaches for a lot of the scenes, and while the acting in the film is nothing spectacular by any means, I still give those actors all the credit in the world for working with real fucking cockroaches. Like, I can't even imagine that. Like, I've been around cockroaches before because I have a friend whose house is crawling with them, but I can't imagine, like, going through what some of these actors went through, actually having these things crawling on them. Like, it really will make you cringe if you have a fear of bugs. Now, a huge deviation from the book is in the movie, the roaches are actually able to mutate into the form of what they feed on. So at one point you get a roach/cat hybrid, which is pretty freaking creepy looking, and you also get a roach/human hybrid at one point. And at the end of the movie, you see the cockroach queen, which is this horrible monstrosity with human faces and skulls and shit. And what's funny about that is I actually had seen this movie when I was a little kid without even realizing it, because that image of the roach queen, I remember seeing that on TV as a little kid, but not remembering what the movie was until recently when I watched the movie in preparation for this video. And like I said, the characters in the movie are completely different from the book. Now, in the book you had the character of Sheriff Amos Tarbell, who was one of the main characters, whereas in the movie they make him the lead protagonist, and they change his first name to Richard in the film. The character of Elizabeth is in the movie, but whereas in the book she had a romance with the character of Peter Hubbard, in the movie she has a relationship with Sheriff Tarbell. Now, in the novel, Elizabeth had a very close relationship with her grandfather, whereas in the movie, it's actually her father, and her father ends up being kind of a villain in the film because you find out that he is partly responsible for what's going on the island, although he does have a redemption towards the end of the film. Now, in the book, you had two scientists, Dr. Peter Hubbard and a female scientist, whereas in the film, they combine the two scientists into one character, and they make her the main human antagonist of the film. But yeah, while the movie is certainly not one of my favorite 80s horror films by any means, it is a fun movie, and it has developed a cult following over the years. Now, I know Guillermo del Toro's Mimic is based on a short story that apparently predates both the book and the movie The Nest, but I swear Mimic must have borrowed at least a little bit from the movie version of The Nest. Now, don't get me wrong, Mimic is a way better movie than The Nest, but there are these little similarities, like scientists developing a mutant version of cockroaches to kill regular cockroaches. Now, in Mimic, it made a lot more sense, because in Mimic, you found out that cockroaches were spreading a plague that was killing children. And yes, I know the Judas breed from Mimic weren't exactly cockroaches, they were sort of a new form of insect, but the fact that you had them sort of taking on slightly human-like forms, I feel like Del Toro must have been at least familiar with The Nest. Now, there was also a made-for-TV horror film in the early 2000s called They Nest, which is not considered to be a straight adaptation of this book, but I would not be surprised if that movie was maybe somewhat inspired by this book, because I believe that film is also set in sort of an island community, and it's also about killer roaches. But yeah, that was my review on The Nest by Eli Cantor, published under the pen name Gregory A. Douglas, and bye.